The rope creaked against the ancient oak's branch as Henry Caldwell's body swayed in the humid Memphis twilight. His Sunday best was now wrinkled and stained. The plantation's other slaves would find him at dawn, but by then, Isaiah Turner would be miles away, his footprints already washed clean by the evening rain. What drove a quiet field hand to commit such an act after years of silent obedience? The answer was buried in secrets that would die with Henry that night. Secrets that had festered like untreated wounds beneath the polite veneer of Sunday worship. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning had begun like countless others on the Caldwell plantation, with the plantation bell clanging across the cotton fields at first light. Isaiah Turner rose from his straw mattress in the slave quarters, his tall frame unfolding with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed this ritual for 28 years. At 35, Isaiah carried himself with a quiet dignity that made other slaves look to him for guidance, though he rarely spoke unless directly addressed. His dark eyes held depths that suggested intelligence carefully hidden beneath layers of learned subservience. The Memphis plantation stretched across 800 acres of rich delta soil. Its main house stood like a white monument to prosperity, built on the backs of human cattle. Henry Caldwell had inherited the estate from his father 3 years prior, along with 47 slaves and a reputation for being more reasonable than most masters in the region. The younger Caldwell prided himself on running what he called a Christian household, requiring all his slaves to attend Sunday services and maintaining that he treated his property with biblical kindness. Isaiah had been born on this land, sold as an infant along with his mother, Rebecca, when the previous owner needed quick cash to pay gambling debts. Rebecca had died of fever when Isaiah was 12, but not before teaching him to read, using pages torn from a discarded Bible she had found in the main house. This secret education had become Isaiah's most dangerous possession, something that could cost him his life if discovered. He kept his literacy hidden like a blade against his ribs, sharp and ready, but invisible to those who owned his flesh. The October morning carried the crisp promise of winter, and Isaiah pulled on his only clean shirt, the one reserved for church Sundays. Around him, other slaves prepared for the weekly ritual that none could avoid. Master Caldwell insisted that all his property attend services at the small wooden church he had built near the main house, where a traveling preacher would deliver sermons about obedience, patience, and the rewards that awaited the faithful in the next life. Isaiah had sat through hundreds of these services, listening to scripture twisted into chains, watching white faces nod approvingly as the preacher explained how slavery was part of God's divine plan. The walk to church followed the same path Isaiah had taken every Sunday for decades, winding past the cotton fields where he spent his days under the merciless sun. Other plantation slaves joined the procession, creating a river of dark faces, moving toward the white church that stood like an accusation against the blue sky. Isaiah walked near the back, as was his custom, observing the complex social dynamics that played out even among the enslaved. There were the house slaves who carried themselves with carefully cultivated superiority, the field hands who moved with the weary resignation of those who knew their place, and the children who had not yet learned to dim the light in their eyes. Henry Caldwell rode alongside the procession on his chestnut mare, occasionally calling out greetings to his neighbors, who were similarly accompanied by their human property. At 28, Caldwell was considered one of the more progressive plantation owners in the region, a man who claimed to wrestle with the moral complexities of slavery while continuing to profit from it. He had recently married Margaret Whitmore, daughter of a prominent Memphis banker, and the union had elevated his social standing considerably. The young master often spoke of his desire to modernize the plantation, to find more humane ways to manage his workforce. Though these philosophical musings never translated into actual changes in the slaves' daily lives, the church service began with familiar hymns. The slaves' voices rose in harmony, while their master sat in the front pews, occasionally glancing back to ensure proper participation. Reverend Clayton, a circuit preacher who served several plantations in the area, took his place behind the simple wooden pulpit and began his sermon with passages from Ephesians about servants obeying their masters. Isaiah had memorized most of these sermons by now, the same biblical justifications for bondage delivered with slight variations, but consistent themes. As the preacher droned on about the virtues of submissiveness and the divine order that placed some men in authority over others, Isaiah's mind wandered to the book hidden beneath the floorboards of his cabin. 3 months ago, he had discovered a volume that had fallen from a merchant's wagon near the main road, a collection of speeches by abolitionists that painted a very different picture of Christianity than what he heard each Sunday. The contrast between the Jesus who proclaimed freedom for the captives and the Christ presented in this church created a tension in Isaiah's chest that grew stronger each week. The sermon continued with Reverend Clayton's nasal voice, explaining how slavery was a burden that white Christians bore for the benefit of their African charges, how the plantation system provided structure and purpose for a people too primitive to care for themselves. Isaiah watched the faces around him, seeing the mixture of resignation and suppressed anger that these words produced. Some slaves had learned to find genuine comfort in religion, using faith as a shield against daily humiliation. But others, like Isaiah, struggled with the contradiction between the gospel's promise of liberation and their present reality. Margaret Caldwell sat in the front pew beside her husband, her pale blue dress and matching hat marking her as distinctly separate from the darker congregation behind her. She was 22, raised in Memphis society, with all the privileges that white skin and family wealth could provide. Margaret had been educated in proper deportment, piano playing, and the management of household slaves, skills considered essential for a plantation wife. Her marriage to Henry had been as much a business arrangement as a romantic union, joining his agricultural wealth with her family's financial connections. During the service, Isaiah noticed something that had been occurring with increasing frequency over the past several weeks. Henry Caldwell kept glancing toward the back of the church, his eyes seeking out and lingering on a young slave woman named Clarissa, who worked in the main house kitchen. Clarissa was 18, with features that reflected the complex racial mixing that occurred on plantations, despite laws and social taboos forbidding such relationships. Her light skin and delicate bone structure suggested European ancestry, though she had been born into bondage like the rest of the slaves. The predatory nature of Caldwell's attention was unmistakable to those who knew how to read such signs. Isaiah had witnessed this pattern before on other plantations, had seen how masters exercised their power over enslaved women who had no legal or physical means to refuse their advances. The peculiar institution of slavery created conditions where such abuse was not only possible, but protected by law, where the violation of enslaved women was considered a property right rather than a crime. As the service concluded with another hymn, Isaiah felt the familiar weight of Sunday's aftermath settling on his shoulders. The slaves would return to their quarters for their one afternoon of relative rest, while their masters retired to grand dinners and social visits with neighboring plantation families. This division of leisure time served as another reminder of the fundamental inequalities that defined their existence. The way freedom and humanity were parceled out according to skin color and social position. The walk back to the quarters usually provided Isaiah with time to think, to process the contradictions he had heard, and prepare mentally for another week of backbreaking labor. But today felt different somehow, charged with a tension that he could not quite identify. The October air carried hints of the coming winter, and the changing season seemed to mirror some internal shift that Isaiah sensed, but could not yet name. He had been experiencing these moments of heightened awareness more frequently lately, as if his long-suppressed anger was finally finding cracks in the carefully constructed walls he had built around it. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the Mississippi River, Isaiah sat outside his cabin, reading the hidden book by the last rays of daylight. The words of Frederick Douglass seemed to leap from the page, describing the transformative power of literacy and the way knowledge could break the mental chains that held enslaved people in bondage, even when physical escape seemed impossible. Douglass wrote about the moment when he realized that education was the pathway from slavery to freedom. And Isaiah felt that same revelation burning in his chest, like a coal that refused to be extinguished. The sound of approaching footsteps made Isaiah quickly hide the book beneath his worn jacket. But the visitor was only old Moses, a fellow field hand who had survived 6 decades of plantation life through a combination of wisdom and careful neutrality. Moses settled beside Isaiah on the cabin's single step, his weathered face reflecting the accumulated sorrows of a lifetime spent in bondage. "You've been mighty quiet lately, son," Moses observed, his voice carrying the careful modulation that slaves learn to use when discussing potentially dangerous topics. "Something eating at you?" Isaiah considered his response carefully, knowing that even among slaves, careless words could find their way back to the master's ears through informants who traded information for small privileges or protection from punishment. "Just thinking about things," he replied, which was true enough without being specific. Moses nodded knowingly, understanding the code of careful communication that allowed enslaved people to share their thoughts without directly challenging the system that oppressed them. "Thinking can be dangerous for folks like us," he said, "but sometimes it's the only thing that keeps a man's soul alive." The 2 men sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the plantation, each lost in his own thoughts about the complexities of survival and resistance under slavery. Around them, other slaves were ending their day with the small rituals that provided structure and meaning in lives that officially belonged to other people. Children played quiet games in the dirt between cabins. Women mended clothes by firelight, and men carved wooden trinkets or repaired tools that would be needed for tomorrow's labor. Isaiah's cabin stood at the edge of the slave quarters, positioned so that he could see both the main house and the road that led away from the plantation toward Memphis and points unknown. This vantage point had become both a blessing and a curse, providing him with information about the plantation's operations, while constantly reminding him of the world that existed beyond his reach. Through his small window, he could observe the comings and goings of the white family, their visitors, and the complex social dynamics that played out in the big house. That night, as Isaiah prepared for sleep, he noticed unusual activity around the main house. Henry Caldwell had dismissed the house slaves early and was walking alone in the garden behind the mansion, his behavior suggesting agitation or deep contemplation. Margaret had retired to her room with complaints of a headache, leaving her husband to pace among the carefully tended flowers and ornamental shrubs that were maintained by slave labor. Isaiah watched through his window as Caldwell walked the same path repeatedly, occasionally stopping to look toward the slave quarters with an expression that was difficult to read in the moonlight. The master's restlessness was unusual, as he typically maintained strict routines that reflected his desire to project authority and control. This deviation from pattern caught Isaiah's attention and filed itself away in the mental catalog he maintained of potentially significant information. The following morning brought the familiar routine of field work, with slaves gathering before dawn to receive their daily assignments from the overseer, a harsh man named Briggs, who carried a leather whip and the authority to use it at his discretion. Briggs had been hired by Henry's father and retained by the son, despite his reputation for excessive brutality, mainly because he produced consistent cotton yields and maintained discipline through fear rather than the more expensive method of incentives. Isaiah's assignment took him to the section of fields closest to the main house, where he could observe the daily routines of the white family while maintaining the appearance of focused attention to his work. The cotton plants were heavy with their white burden, ready for the harvest that would determine the plantation's profitability for the year and, by extension, the treatment that slaves could expect during the winter months. As the morning progressed, Isaiah noticed Caldwell emerging from the main house earlier than usual, dressed in work clothes rather than his typical planter's attire. The master walked purposefully toward the kitchen building, a separate structure that housed the plantation's food preparation and storage facilities. Isaiah continued picking cotton while keeping track of Caldwell's movements, a skill he had developed over years of careful observation. Through the kitchen's open door, Isaiah could see Clarissa working at the large wooden table where meals were prepared for both the main house and the slave quarters. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to anticipate needs and avoid mistakes that might result in punishment. Her presence in the kitchen, combined with Caldwell's unusual visit to that area, created a situation that Isaiah recognized as potentially dangerous. The interaction between master and slave woman was brief but intense. Their body language suggested a conversation that was anything but routine. Caldwell stood closer to Clarissa than propriety would normally allow, and her posture reflected the tension of someone trapped in an impossible situation. Isaiah could not hear their words over the distance and the sounds of fieldwork, but the dynamics were unmistakable to anyone familiar with the ways power operated on plantations. When Caldwell finally left the kitchen, his expression carried a satisfaction that made Isaiah's stomach turn with recognition and rage. Clarissa remained at her workstation, but her movements had lost their earlier fluidity, becoming mechanical and disconnected, as if she were trying to distance herself mentally from whatever had just occurred. The scene played out like countless others across the South, where enslaved women had no protection against their master's desires and no recourse when those desires were acted upon. The rest of the workday passed in a haze of barely controlled anger for Isaiah, his hands moving automatically through the familiar motions of cotton picking, while his mind wrestled with the implications of what he had witnessed. The powerlessness that defined every aspect of slave existence seemed to crystallize in that moment, becoming a weight that threatened to crush whatever remained of his spirit. He had watched injustices for decades, had learned to swallow his rage and channel it into survival. But something about this particular violation felt like a breaking point. As the sun reached its peak, providing the brief rest period that field hands were allowed during the hottest part of the day, Isaiah found himself walking toward the kitchen building with a purpose he had not consciously formed. The other slaves had sought shade and water, leaving him relatively alone as he approached the separate structure that housed the plantation's food operations. Clarissa was sitting on the kitchen steps, her face turned toward the fields, but her eyes focused on something far beyond the immediate landscape. The tears she had been crying were nearly dry, leaving only the red-rimmed evidence of her distress. She looked up as Isaiah approached, and her expression reflected the complex mixture of shame and defiance that was common among slave women who had been subjected to their master's attentions. "You saw," she said simply, making it a statement rather than a question. Her voice carried the flat tone of someone who had moved beyond immediate emotion into the numb territory that served as protection against overwhelming pain. Isaiah nodded, settling beside her on the steps with the careful consideration that such moments required. Direct discussion of a master's behavior was dangerous territory, but silence felt like complicity in the face of obvious wrong. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said finally, the words coming from a place of solidarity that transcended the usual boundaries between field hands and house slaves. Clarissa laughed bitterly, a sound that held no humor, but considerable pain. Don't I? What choice do any of us have when they decide they want something from us? I can submit and keep my position in the house, or I can resist and find myself picking cotton until my hands bleed. And assuming Briggs doesn't decide to make an example of me first. The truth of her situation hung between them like a physical presence, highlighting the impossible choices that slavery forced upon its victims. Resistance could bring death or torture, but compliance meant the slow destruction of dignity and self-worth. Isaiah had watched other enslaved women navigate these treacherous waters, had seen some survive through careful accommodation, while others were broken by the constant violation of their humanity. He's been watching me for weeks, Clarissa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Started with comments about my appearance, then finding reasons to touch my hand when I served his meals. Today, he made his intentions clear. Told me I had a choice to be grateful for his attention or to learn what happened to ungrateful slaves. Isaiah felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same anger that had been accumulating for years, like sediment in a riverbed. But alongside the fury was something new, a clarity that seemed to cut through the usual fog of helplessness that surrounded such situations. For the first time in his adult life, Isaiah began to contemplate the possibility of direct action rather than passive endurance. What if there was another choice? He asked quietly, the words surprising him as much as they did Clarissa. What if submission and suffering weren't the only options? Clarissa turned to study his face, searching for the meaning behind his carefully chosen words. What are you saying, Isaiah? You know there's no law that protects us from men like him. No authority we can appeal to for justice. He owns us as surely as he owns his horses or his furniture. Isaiah nodded, acknowledging the legal reality while refusing to accept its moral validity. Legal and right aren't always the same thing, he said, thinking of the passages he had read about natural law and divine justice. Sometimes, a man has to decide which master he truly serves. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the work bell, calling field hands back to their afternoon labor. But the words that had been spoken continued to resonate in both their minds as they returned to their respective duties. Isaiah walked back to the cotton fields with a sense of purpose that had been absent from his life for years, while Clarissa returned to the kitchen, carrying the knowledge that she was not entirely alone in her struggle. The afternoon work session passed with unusual speed for Isaiah, his hands moving through the cotton plants, while his mind explored possibilities that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The hidden book had planted seeds of revolutionary thought, but it was the immediate injustice against Clarissa that provided the catalyst for those ideas to crystallize into something approaching a plan. By evening, when the slaves were finally released from their labor to prepare for another night's rest, Isaiah had reached a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to him that morning. The carefully constructed walls of self-preservation that had kept him alive for 35 years were crumbling in the face of accumulated rage and newfound clarity about the nature of justice. The slave quarters buzzed with their usual evening activities, but Isaiah felt disconnected from the familiar rhythms of community life. He ate his meager dinner without tasting it, participated in conversations without hearing the words, and went through the motions of preparing for sleep, while his mind remained intensely focused on plans that were still taking shape. Later that night, when the plantation had settled into the quiet darkness that preceded dawn, Isaiah slipped out of his cabin and made his way carefully toward the main house. The moon provided enough light to navigate the familiar paths while maintaining the caution necessary to avoid detection by anyone who might report his unauthorized movement to the overseer. The main house stood like a white monument against the dark sky, its columns and symmetrical facade representing all the wealth and privilege built on slave labor. Isaiah had approached this building thousands of times over the years, usually in daylight and always in service to the family that owned him. But tonight felt different. Charged with purpose and possibility rather than routine obligation, he moved around to the garden behind the house, where carefully maintained flower beds and ornamental shrubs created a landscape of beauty that slaves were allowed to tend but never enjoy. The garden represented another layer of the plantation's contradictions, where enslaved people created environments of peace and beauty for masters who denied them the most basic human dignities. Isaiah settled into the shadows near the garden's edge, positioned where he could observe the main house while remaining invisible to anyone who might glance out the windows. The waiting felt different from the passive endurance that had characterized most of his adult life, filled with intention rather than resignation. Time moved slowly as he maintained his vigil, but the hours passed with the inevitability of water flowing toward the sea. Near midnight, a light appeared in one of the main house windows, followed by the sight of Henry Caldwell moving through the rooms with the restless energy that Isaiah had observed the previous evening. The master appeared to be unable to sleep, perhaps troubled by conscience or anticipation of future violations. Whatever thoughts were keeping Caldwell awake, they had created the opportunity that Isaiah had been hoping to find. The master eventually emerged from the house wearing a robe over his nightclothes, carrying an oil lamp that cast dancing shadows across the garden landscape. Caldwell walked among the flower beds with the same agitated pace Isaiah had observed before, occasionally stopping to examine plants or simply to stand in contemplation of thoughts that remained hidden. Isaiah remained motionless in his hiding place, observing Caldwell's behavior while considering the various possibilities that might emerge from this nighttime encounter. The master's solitary wandering suggested vulnerability that rarely existed during daylight hours, when the plantation's social structure provided layers of protection and authority. After nearly an hour of restless movement through the garden, Caldwell finally settled on a bench beneath the plantation's most prominent feature, an enormous oak tree that had stood on this land long before the first slaves were brought to work its soil. The tree was ancient and massive, its branches spreading wide enough to provide shade for half the main house during summer afternoons. Local legend held that the tree had been a gathering place for Native Americans before European settlement, making it a witness to multiple cycles of displacement and oppression. Caldwell extinguished his lamp and sat in the darkness beneath the oak's branches, apparently finding some peace in the tree's silent presence. Isaiah could see the master's silhouette against the slightly lighter sky, a figure that represented all the power and privilege that the plantation system existed to protect. The contrast between Caldwell's voluntary solitude and Isaiah's enforced bondage highlighted the arbitrary nature of the social structures that determined their respective positions. Isaiah rose from his hiding place and began moving slowly toward the oak tree, his bare feet making no sound on the soft grass of the garden. His approach was guided by instincts that had been sharpened by decades of necessity. The ability to move unseen and unheard that was essential for slave survival. Each step brought him closer to a confrontation that would change everything, regardless of its outcome. Caldwell remained unaware of Isaiah's approach until the slave was close enough to reach out and touch the master's shoulder. The sudden realization that he was no longer alone caused Caldwell to start and turn, his face reflecting surprise, and then growing alarm as he recognized the tall figure standing beside the bench. "Isaiah," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that masters use to maintain control, even in unexpected situations. "What are you doing out here? You should be in your quarters." Isaiah stood silently for a moment, studying the face of the man who had owned him for 3 years, and before that had inherited the legal right to control every aspect of his existence. In the moonlight, Caldwell looked younger than his 28 years, his features reflecting the privileged softness of someone who had never known physical hardship or genuine fear. "I came to talk to you about Clarissa," Isaiah said finally, his voice carrying none of the deferential tone that slaves were expected to use when addressing white people. The absence of the usual master or sir hung in the air like a challenge, marking this conversation as fundamentally different from any previous interaction between them. Caldwell's expression shifted from alarm to anger, the reflexive response of someone whose authority was being questioned by a person who had no legal right to question anything. "You forget yourself, boy," he said, rising from the bench to emphasize the height advantage that white supremacy insisted was crucial to maintaining proper relationships. "Whatever you think you know about my business is none of your concern." Isaiah remained motionless, his tall frame creating an imposing presence that contradicted the subservient role he had played for so many years. "She's 18 years old," he said quietly, "barely more than a child, and she has no protection against your intentions." The master's face flushed with anger at the slave's presumption in discussing such matters, and his hand moved instinctively toward his waist, where he would normally carry a whip or pistol during daylight encounters with potentially rebellious slaves. Finding neither weapon, Caldwell fell back on the verbal authority that the plantation system granted to white men in all interactions with black people. "How dare you speak to me about my property and my rights?" Caldwell said, his voice rising despite the need to avoid waking the household. "I can do whatever I choose with any slave on this plantation, and you would do well to remember your place before you find yourself hanging from this very tree." The threat was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his ability to destroy lives with a word or gesture. But Isaiah heard it differently than he would have just days earlier. Instead of the paralyzing fear that such words usually produced, he felt a strange calm settling over him, like armor against the master's rage. "Maybe," Isaiah said, taking a step closer to Caldwell. "But tonight you're out here alone, away from your overseer and your whips and all the laws that protect you during the day. Tonight you're just one man talking to another man under this old tree." Caldwell's anger faltered slightly as he began to recognize the dangerous shift in the dynamics between them. The way Isaiah's demeanor had changed from subservience to something that resembled equality. The master's eyes darted toward the main house, calculating distances and possibilities for summoning help if the situation continued to deteriorate. "You're making a mistake that will cost you your life," Caldwell said. But his voice now carried uncertainty rather than absolute authority. "Even if you harm me, there's nowhere you can run that they won't find you. They'll hunt you down like a rabid dog and make an example of you that will be remembered for generations." Isaiah nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of Caldwell's words while refusing to let that truth determine his actions. "You're probably right about that," he agreed. "But that doesn't change what's happening here tonight, or what you've been doing to Clarissa, or what you plan to do to her tomorrow and the next day and every day after that, until you get tired of her." The conversation had reached a point that neither man had anticipated, a moment where the usual rules of plantation life seemed suspended by the darkness and isolation of their encounter. Caldwell could feel his advantage slipping away despite his legal and social superiority, while Isaiah experienced a clarity that came from finally acknowledging truths he had been suppressing for decades. "Listen to me carefully," Caldwell said, attempting to regain control through a combination of threat and negotiation. "If you return to your quarters now and forget this conversation ever happened, I'll overlook your insolence. But if you continue down this path, you'll force me to have you whipped until you can't stand, assuming I don't decide you're too dangerous to keep alive." Isaiah considered the offer, recognizing it as probably the last opportunity to return to the relative safety of his previous existence. The smart choice, The survival choice would be to submit once again to the system that had kept him alive for 35 years while slowly consuming his soul. But intelligence and wisdom were not the same thing, and some moments demanded actions that transcended mere survival. "No," Isaiah said simply, the single word carrying the weight of a lifetime's accumulated rage and a decision that could not be taken back. "I'm done pretending that any of this is right. Done acting like you have some God-given authority to own people and use them however you want." Caldwell took a step backward, finally understanding that this encounter was not going to end with the usual restoration of plantation hierarchy. His hand fumbled in his robe pocket for any weapon or tool that might provide protection, but found only the small knife he used for cutting cigars, inadequate for defending against a man of Isaiah's size and evident determination. "You're signing your own death warrant," Caldwell said, drawing the small blade and holding it between them like a symbol of white authority rather than an effective weapon. "And probably the death warrants of every slave on this plantation, because they'll assume the others knew about your plans." Isaiah looked at the tiny knife with something approaching pity, seeing it as a perfect representation of how artificial the master's power had always been. Strip away the laws and social structures, and armed men who enforced those laws, and what remained was one human being trying to dominate another through pure will and historical accident. "That knife isn't going to save you," Isaiah observed, taking another step forward. "And neither is all the authority you think you have over me. Out here right now, you're just a man who chose to hurt a young woman because he had the power to do it and thought no one would stop him." Caldwell lunged forward with the small blade, aiming for Isaiah's chest in a desperate attempt to maintain control through violence, but the slave moved aside easily and caught the master's wrist in a grip that was both gentle and absolutely immovable. The knife fell to the ground between them, and Caldwell found himself held by hands that were calloused from decades of cotton picking and strengthened by years of physical labor that his privileged life had never required. "Please," Caldwell said, the word emerging with difficulty from a man who had never been forced to beg for anything. "Whatever you're planning, think about the consequences. Think about what will happen to the other slaves when I'm discovered dead." Isaiah maintained his grip on Caldwell's wrist while considering the master's words, recognizing the cruel truth they contained. Plantation justice was collective and brutal, designed to prevent exactly the kind of resistance he was contemplating. The death of a master would likely result in torture and execution for multiple slaves, regardless of their actual involvement in the act. "You're right about that," Isaiah admitted, his voice carrying genuine sorrow for the consequences that others would face. "But what you're not understanding is that some things are worse than death, and watching you destroy that girl while I do nothing is one of them." The admission seemed to drain the last hope from Caldwell's face, as he recognized that normal calculations of self-interest were not going to resolve this situation. He had encountered slave resistance before, but always within the boundaries of the system that ultimately protected white supremacy. This felt different, more final, like a fundamental rejection of the entire social order rather than simple rebellion against specific conditions. "If you kill me," Caldwell said, making one final attempt at negotiation, "I can't promise that Clarissa will be safe. My wife might sell her out of spite, or the new overseer might treat her even worse than I would have." Isaiah's grip tightened slightly on Caldwell's wrist, causing the master to wince with pain as he realized that his attempt at psychological manipulation had backfired. The slave's expression hardened into something that was both terrible and completely focused, like a force of nature that had been building pressure for decades before finally finding release. "You still don't understand," Isaiah said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had moved beyond fear or doubt. This isn't about saving Clarissa, though I pray she'll find some way to protect herself after tonight. This is about 35 years of watching people like you destroy people like us, while calling it Christian duty." With his free hand, Isaiah reached into his jacket and withdrew a length of rope that he had taken from the plantation's tool shed. Strong hemp designed for securing loads and capable of bearing far more weight than one man's body. The rope had been prepared with a noose during the long hours when he had been developing his plan, tied with knots learned during his years of plantation work. Caldwell's eyes widened as he recognized both the rope and the implications of its presence, understanding finally that this encounter had been planned rather than spontaneous. The knowledge that he was facing premeditated action rather than momentary passion seemed to terrify him more than the immediate physical threat, perhaps because it suggested a level of determination that could not be reasoned with or deflected. "You can't be serious about this," Caldwell said, his voice rising toward panic, despite his continued need to avoid waking the household. "Hanging a white man is not just murder. It's an attack on the entire system. They'll burn down half the county looking for whoever did this." Isaiah began walking Caldwell toward the massive oak tree, maintaining his grip on the master's wrist, while guiding them both toward the ancient branches that would serve his purpose. The tree had witnessed countless injustices during its long existence, had provided shade for slave auctions and whippings, had probably supported the bodies of other black men who had been lynched for far less serious offenses than what Isaiah was contemplating. "I know exactly what they'll do," Isaiah said as they reached the tree's base, "but that doesn't change what's right, and it doesn't change what I'm going to do." The massive trunk rose before them like a monument to endurance, its bark scarred by decades of weather and human activity, but its core remaining strong and unyielding. Isaiah selected a branch that was both accessible and sturdy enough for his purpose, one that would hold a man's weight without breaking and leave the body visible to anyone who approached from the main house. Caldwell made a final attempt at physical resistance, trying to break free from Isaiah's grip and run toward the main house where help might be available. But 35 years of fieldwork had built strength in the slave that the master could not match, and the attempted escape was stopped almost before it began. Isaiah caught Caldwell easily and forced him back against the oak's trunk, the rope now a tangible presence between them. "I'll give you 1 minute to pray," Isaiah said, beginning to fashion the noose around Caldwell's neck, with movements that were both careful and deliberate. "Whatever God you think you serve, whatever you believe about salvation and damnation, now would be the time to make your peace." Caldwell's response was a mixture of prayer and cursing, biblical phrases interspersed with threats and pleas that reflected the complete breakdown of his worldview in the face of this reversal of plantation power dynamics. He called upon God to witness his innocence, demanded that Isaiah remember his place in the social order, and promised rewards and punishments that now seemed equally meaningless. Isaiah listened to this outpouring while completing his preparations, his hands moving with the practiced competence that had characterized all his work throughout his enslaved existence. The irony was not lost on him that the skills learned in bondage were now being used to end the life of his master, that the rope work taught during years of cotton harvesting would serve this final purpose. "Time's up," Isaiah said quietly, and with a motion that was both swift and surprisingly gentle, he threw the rope's free end over the selected branch and began to pull. Caldwell's feet left the ground gradually, his struggles becoming more desperate, as the reality of his situation eliminated any remaining hope of survival or rescue. The hanging was neither quick nor easy, as Isaiah had neither the knowledge nor the inclination to make the process merciful. Caldwell's death came slowly with the terrible sounds that accompanied strangulation and the involuntary movements of a body fighting against its own destruction. Isaiah watched without flinching, his face reflecting neither pleasure nor regret, but rather the grim satisfaction of justice finally achieved. When Caldwell's struggles finally ceased, Isaiah secured the rope to the tree's base and stood back to observe his work. The master's body swayed slightly in the night breeze, casting strange shadows in the moonlight that made the scene appear almost supernatural. The sight was both horrible and somehow appropriate. A visual representation of power structures finally reversed through violence that the plantation system itself had made inevitable. Isaiah remained beneath the oak for several minutes, studying the consequences of his actions while processing emotions that had been suppressed for decades. The rage that had driven him to this moment was beginning to fade, replaced by a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had committed an act that would reshape not only his own fate, but the lives of everyone connected to the plantation. The silence of the night was broken only by the gentle creaking of rope against bark and the distant sounds of nocturnal creatures going about their business, indifferent to the human drama that had just concluded beneath the ancient tree. Isaiah found himself thinking about his mother, Rebecca, wondering what she would have made of this moment, and whether her teachings about forgiveness and endurance had been wisdom or simply another form of bondage. As he turned to leave the scene, Isaiah caught sight of movement in one of the main house windows, a pale face appearing briefly before disappearing again behind curtains. Margaret Caldwell had witnessed at least part of what had transpired, though from her distance in the darkness, she might not have understood the full scope of what she was seeing. The knowledge that there had been an observer added another layer of urgency to Isaiah's need to escape, as discovery was now inevitable rather than merely probable. Isaiah walked calmly back toward the slave quarters, his mind already turning to the practical considerations of flight. He had prepared for this possibility during the weeks when his plan was taking shape, identifying routes and resources that might sustain him during the dangerous journey toward freedom. The Underground Railroad was more legend than reality in this part of Mississippi, but there were rumors of sympathetic individuals and safe houses for those brave enough to attempt escape. The slave quarters remained quiet as Isaiah approached his cabin. The other enslaved people still lost in the brief respite that sleep provided from their daily struggles. He moved silently through the familiar space, gathering the few possessions that might prove useful during flight, while leaving behind everything that connected him to his enslaved existence. The hidden book went into a small bundle, along with the extra shirt and the few coins he had managed to accumulate through occasional small trading with other slaves. Before leaving his cabin for the final time, Isaiah took a piece of charcoal from the cold fireplace and wrote a brief message on the wooden wall where other slaves would be sure to find it. The words were simple but clear. Clarissa, be strong. They cannot own your soul unless you let them. Remember that someone fought for you. He signed it with just his initial, hoping that the message would provide some comfort to the young woman whose suffering had catalyzed his action. The walk away from the plantation began in darkness, but gradually lightened as dawn approached, painting the Mississippi sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Isaiah moved through familiar terrain with the confidence of someone who had worked these fields for decades. But each step carried him further from everything he had ever known, and deeper into uncertainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The main road toward Memphis stretched before him like a river of packed earth, offering the fastest route toward the city, but also the greatest risk of recapture. Slave patrols operated regularly on major thoroughfares, and Isaiah's height and distinctive appearance would make him memorable to anyone who encountered him. The alternative was to travel through swampland and forests, slower and more dangerous, but offering better concealment for a fugitive slave. Isaiah chose the swamps, accepting the additional hardships in exchange for reduced visibility to those who would soon be hunting him. The wetlands that bordered the Mississippi River were treacherous territory, filled with snakes and alligators and areas of quicksand that could trap the unwary, but they also provided cover that was nearly impenetrable to mounted pursuers. Many escaped slaves had died in these swamps, but others had used them successfully as corridors to freedom. Behind him, Isaiah knew that the discovery of Caldwell's body would trigger a massive manhunt involving local law enforcement, federal marshals, and civilian volunteers eager to participate in the capture of a slave who had killed his master. The peculiar institution of slavery depended on the absolute submission of the enslaved population, and any successful resistance threatened the psychological foundations that kept millions of people in bondage. Isaiah's act would be seen not just as murder, but as an attack on the entire social order of the South. The swamp received Isaiah with the indifferent embrace of nature, caring nothing for human laws or social structures, but presenting challenges that were immediate and potentially fatal. He waded through water that reached his waist, feeling for solid footing on the muddy bottom, while scanning the surface for signs of the reptiles that called these wetlands home. The Spanish moss that hung from cypress trees created a canopy that filtered sunlight into an otherworldly green glow, beautiful and ominous in equal measure. Progress through the swamp was measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, as each step required careful consideration of terrain and direction. Isaiah had only a general sense of which way led toward freedom, knowing that Memphis lay to the north, but lacking the detailed knowledge that would ensure he was traveling in the correct direction. The sun provided basic navigation when it was visible through the canopy, but cloud cover and the maze-like nature of the waterways made maintaining a consistent course extremely difficult. By midday, the sounds of pursuit had become audible in the distance, the baying of tracking dogs and the shouts of men echoing across the water from multiple directions. The plantation's discovery of Caldwell's body had clearly triggered the response that Isaiah had anticipated, and the hunt for his killer was already underway. With the systematic thoroughness that characterized such operations, the dogs would follow his scent trail to the edge of the swamp, where the water would complicate but not eliminate their ability to track him. Isaiah pressed deeper into the wetlands, accepting that speed was now more important than stealth. As the gap between him and his pursuers began to narrow, the water grew deeper and the current stronger as he moved toward what he hoped was the main channel of the Mississippi River, the great waterway that had carried so many freedom seekers toward the north and the promise of liberation from bondage. The afternoon brought new challenges as Isaiah encountered areas where the swamp gave way to open water too deep for wading, forcing him to swim while trying to keep his small bundle of possessions dry. His clothes became waterlogged and heavy, slowing his progress and increasing the energy required for each movement forward. Hunger began to gnaw at his stomach, as he had not eaten since the previous evening and had no food supplies for the journey ahead. As evening approached, Isaiah found a relatively dry patch of ground on a small island where he could rest and assess his situation. The sounds of pursuit had faded somewhat, suggesting that the difficult terrain was hampering his hunters as much as it was affecting his own progress. But he knew that the respite was temporary, that come morning, the search would resume with fresh dogs and men who understood the swamp better than he did. The night provided cover for continued movement, but also brought new dangers as the swamp's nocturnal predators became active. Isaiah heard the distinctive bellow of alligators in the distance and the splash of large bodies moving through the water. Sounds that reminded him that he was now in territory where humans were not the dominant species. The darkness made navigation nearly impossible, forcing him to feel his way forward step by careful step, while hoping that his general direction was still carrying him toward freedom, Dawn of the second day revealed that Isaiah had made significant progress through the swamp, reaching areas where the water was shallower and the ground more solid. But it also brought the unwelcome sight of smoke rising from multiple locations behind him, suggesting that his pursuers were using fire to drive him from cover or signal his location to other search parties. The systematic nature of the pursuit indicated that substantial resources were being devoted to his capture, probably including federal marshals and bounty hunters who specialized in returning escaped slaves to their owners. Isaiah's clothes had dried somewhat during the night, but his boots were beginning to fall apart from the constant exposure to water and rough terrain. His feet were developing blisters that made each step painful, and the lack of food was beginning to affect his strength and concentration. The romantic notion of escape that had sustained him during the planning stages was giving way to the brutal reality of survival in hostile territory while being hunted by experienced trackers. The third day brought Isaiah to the edge of the swamp, where solid ground and recognizable terrain offered the promise of faster travel, but also greater exposure to detection. He could see cleared farmland in the distance, which meant roads and settlements, and people who might report the presence of a lone black man traveling without proper documentation. The laws of Mississippi required enslaved people to carry passes when away from their plantations, and Isaiah's lack of such documentation would immediately mark him as a fugitive to anyone who encountered him. Isaiah chose to continue traveling through wooded areas parallel to the roads, accepting slower progress in exchange for reduced visibility to potential informants. The forest provided some protection from observation, while still allowing him to maintain a generally northward direction toward the Tennessee border and the slightly greater possibilities for assistance that might exist in that state. On the fourth day, exhaustion and hunger forced Isaiah to take risks that his better judgment counseled against. He approached a small farmstead where an elderly black man was working alone in a vegetable garden, hoping to find someone who might provide food or information about safe routes toward freedom. The farmer looked up as Isaiah emerged from the tree line, his expression immediately reflecting the wariness that all enslaved people learned when confronted with unexpected situations. "You running?" the old man said, making it a statement rather than a question, as he observed Isaiah's appearance and obvious exhaustion. "They've been hunting somebody through here for days now. Dogs and white men with guns asking questions about strangers." Isaiah nodded, seeing no point in denying what was obvious to anyone with experience of plantation life. "I killed my master," he said simply, watching the farmer's face for signs of judgment or fear. "He was fixing to hurt a young woman, and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen." The farmer studied Isaiah's face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was looking at a dangerous criminal or simply another victim of the slave system who had been pushed beyond endurance. "That's a hanging offense," he said finally. "They catch you. They'll make it slow in public. Make an example that'll keep other folks quiet for years to come." "I know that," Isaiah replied, "but it doesn't change what I did or why I did it. Some things are worth dying for, even if you can't win." The farmer glanced toward his small cabin, where smoke was rising from the chimney, and signs of family life were visible through the windows. "I got grandchildren in there," he said quietly. "If they find out I helped you, those children might pay the price along with me. You understand what I'm saying?" Isaiah nodded, recognizing the impossible position that his presence created for people who had their own survival to consider. "I'm not asking you to risk your family," he said. "Just wondering if you might know which direction offers the best chance of finding help." The farmer looked around carefully, ensuring that their conversation was not being observed, then pointed toward a wooded ridge that rose in the distance. "There's an old hunting cabin about 10 miles that way. Been empty for years as far as I know. Might be a place to rest and get your bearings, assuming you can make it that far without being seen." Isaiah expressed his gratitude and prepared to leave, but the farmer called him back with a gesture toward the vegetable garden. "Take some of these," the old man said, pulling several sweet potatoes from the soil and wrapping them in a piece of cloth. "You'll need something to eat if you're going to keep running." The gift was both practical and symbolic, representing the solidarity that existed among enslaved people despite the risks that such support entailed. Isaiah accepted the food with deep appreciation, understanding that the farmer was endangering himself and his family by providing even this small assistance to a fugitive slave. The journey toward the hunting cabin took Isaiah through terrain that was increasingly familiar, as he had occasionally hunted in these woods during the rare times when Caldwell had allowed slaves to supplement their diet with game. The knowledge of local geography provided some advantage, but it also meant that he was still within the primary search area where his pursuers would concentrate their efforts. The cabin, when Isaiah finally located it, proved to be a ramshackle structure that had clearly been abandoned for several years. The roof leaked, and the door hung askew on its hinges, but the building offered shelter and concealment that were desperately needed. Isaiah settled into the most secure corner of the single room and allowed himself the luxury of rest for the first time since leaving the plantation. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of hanging bodies and pursuing dogs, but it was still the most substantial rest Isaiah had experienced since beginning his flight. When he woke, the sun was setting, and his body felt somewhat restored, despite the ongoing hunger and the pain from his damaged feet. The sweet potatoes provided some nutrition, though eating them raw was difficult, and left him longing for a fire that would have been too dangerous to risk. The fifth night brought Isaiah closer to the Tennessee border, though he had no clear idea of when he might cross that invisible line or what difference it might make in his chances of survival. Tennessee was still a slave state, and the legal penalties for killing a master would be the same regardless of which side of the border he was captured on. But distance from the scene of his crime might provide some protection, and there were rumors that enforcement of fugitive slave laws was less rigorous in some border areas. Isaiah's progress had slowed considerably as his physical condition deteriorated, and the constant stress of pursuit took its toll on his mental clarity. He found himself making mistakes that could have proven fatal, becoming careless about covering his tracks, and occasionally losing his way despite the familiar terrain. The romantic vision of escape that had sustained him during the early stages of flight was being replaced by a grim determination to die free rather than return to slavery. On the sixth day, Isaiah encountered the first sign that his flight might not be entirely hopeless. Hidden beneath a fallen log, he discovered a small cache of supplies that had clearly been placed there deliberately. A knife, some dried meat, and a piece of paper with crude directions toward what might be a safe house or contact point for the Underground Railroad. The discovery suggested that he was not alone in his struggle, that others had traveled this route, and that some form of organized assistance might be available to those who knew where to look. The directions led toward a settlement that Isaiah had heard mentioned, but never visited, a place where free black people were rumored to live alongside sympathetic whites who opposed slavery on religious or moral grounds. Such communities were rare and often unstable, as pro-slavery forces worked constantly to disrupt any challenges to the peculiar institution, but they represented the only hope for assistance that a fugitive slave might realistically expect to find. The approach to the settlement required crossing open farmland during daylight hours, a risk that Isaiah had been avoiding throughout his flight, but which now seemed necessary if he was to reach potential allies before his pursuers caught up with him. He waited until late afternoon, when the angle of the sun would make his silhouette less visible to distant observers. Then began the dangerous crossing of cleared fields that offered no concealment from anyone who might be watching. The settlement, when Isaiah finally reached it, appeared to be a collection of modest farmsteads clustered around a small church and general store. The population was mixed with both black and white families, visible going about their daily business, a sight so unusual in Mississippi that Isaiah wondered if he had somehow crossed into free territory without realizing it. The presence of armed men at several locations suggested that the community was prepared to defend itself against hostile forces, though whether those forces represented law enforcement or pro-slavery vigilantes was unclear. Isaiah's approach to the settlement was observed by sentries who challenged him before he could reach the main cluster of buildings. The men who confronted him were both black and white, carrying weapons and displaying the alertness of people who expected trouble. Their questions were direct and specific, designed to determine whether Isaiah was a genuine fugitive in need of assistance or a spy sent to infiltrate their operations. "Where are you coming from, and why should we trust you?" asked the leader of the group, a tall white man whose bearing suggested military experience and whose eyes reflected the weariness of someone who had seen too much violence. "We've had bounty hunters posing as runaway slaves trying to get information about our routes and safe houses." Isaiah understood the necessity for caution while recognizing that his survival might depend on gaining these people's trust. "I killed Henry Caldwell at his plantation 6 days ago," he said, providing details that would be impossible to fake and could be verified through wanted posters that were certainly circulating by now. "He was going to hurt a young woman named Clarissa, and I couldn't watch that happen and still call myself a man." The admission created a stir among Isaiah's questioners, as his name and crime had clearly reached even this remote community through the networks that connected opponents of slavery throughout the region. The leader studied Isaiah's face carefully, comparing it to descriptions that had apparently preceded his arrival. "If you're really Isaiah Turner," the man said, "then you're the most wanted fugitive in 3 states right now. They're offering a $1,000 reward for your capture, dead or alive. And that kind of money brings out every bounty hunter and slave catcher between here and New Orleans." Isaiah nodded, understanding that his presence endangered everyone in the settlement, while recognizing that he had no other options for survival. "I know I'm bringing trouble with me," he said, "but I'm hoping you might know a way to get me further north. Maybe to somewhere the reward money won't be so tempting." The leader exchanged glances with his companions before making a decision that would affect not only Isaiah's fate, but the safety of their entire community. "We'll help you," he said finally, "but you need to understand that from here on, you're part of something bigger than just your own escape. There are others depending on the routes we use, and if you're captured, you could destroy networks that have taken years to build." Isaiah was led into the settlement proper, where he encountered a level of organization and purpose that exceeded anything he had imagined about underground railroad operations. The community served as a major way station for escaped slaves heading north, with carefully planned routes, communication systems, and defensive preparations that reflected both the importance of their work and the dangers they faced in carrying it out. The next phase of Isaiah's journey would take him through territory that was even more dangerous than what he had already traversed, but also closer to the possibility of genuine freedom in states where slavery had been abolished. The $1,000 bounty on his head would make every mile hazardous, as that sum represented more money than most people in the region would see in several years of honest work. But for the first time since leaving the plantation, Isaiah felt something approaching hope, the knowledge that he was no longer alone in his struggle against the forces that sought to return him to bondage. The rope that had ended Henry Caldwell's life had also severed Isaiah's connection to the world of slavery, and whatever happened next would be as a free man rather than as someone else's property. A week later, word reached the settlement that Margaret Caldwell had sold the plantation and moved back to Memphis, unable to manage the property alone and unwilling to face the constant reminders of her husband's violent death. Clarissa had been sold to a family in New Orleans, her fate unknown, but her suffering likely to continue under new masters, who might prove even more brutal than Henry had been. The ancient oak tree still stood on what had been the Caldwell plantation, its branches now bearing a different kind of fruit than they had in previous years. Local legend would grow around that tree and the events that had transpired beneath it. Stories that would be told in slave quarters throughout the region about the man who had refused to accept that some injustices were simply part of the natural order of things. Isaiah Turner had disappeared into the network of sympathizers and safe houses that comprised the Underground Railroad. His trail growing cold as professional conductors took over his transport toward the Canadian border. Whether he survived the journey to reach true freedom remained unknown to those he left behind. But his example lived on in the whispered conversations of enslaved people who dared to imagine that resistance was possible. The story of the slave who left his master hanging from the oak tree after Sunday service would become a powerful symbol throughout the remaining years before the Civil War, a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, individual acts of courage could challenge systems of oppression and inspire others to believe that freedom was worth any risk. Whether Isaiah Turner lived to see slavery's eventual abolition or died in the attempt to reach free soil, he had already achieved a form of immortality through his refusal to accept the unacceptable and his willingness to pay any price for the dignity that slavery sought to destroy. Years later, when the war finally came and Union troops marched through Mississippi, liberating plantations and breaking the chains that had bound millions in bondage, some of those soldiers would stop beneath the great oak tree where Henry Caldwell had met his end. They would listen to the stories told by newly freed slaves about the man who had chosen justice over survival. And they would understand that the rebellion they were fighting to preserve the Union had begun not with their armies, but with individual acts of conscience that refused to accept evil as inevitable. The oak tree remained standing long after the plantation house crumbled and the fields returned to wilderness, a living monument to the night when one enslaved man decided that some things were worth dying for, and that sometimes the only response to systematic evil was equally systematic resistance. In its spreading branches, local people claimed they could still hear the echo of that final confrontation between master and slave, a reminder that power built on oppression contained the seeds of its own destruction. Isaiah Turner's name would be forgotten by history books that preferred to record the deeds of generals and politicians, but it lived on in the oral traditions of communities that understood the true cost of freedom and the courage required to claim it. Whether he died in the swamps of Mississippi or lived to build a new life in Canada, his legacy endured in every enslaved person who chose resistance over submission, every act of rebellion that chipped away at the foundations of the peculiar institution, every moment when human dignity refused to bow before human cruelty. The story ended where it began, with a rope and a tree and the simple truth that some injustices demand a response that transcends law and custom and the careful calculations of survival. Isaiah Turner had made that response, and in doing so had proven that even in slavery's darkest hour, the human spirit could still choose freedom over safety, justice over life itself, and the brief, bright flame of resistance over the long, slow death of acceptance.